So thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. Thanks to Professor Weidmann for his invitation, and thank you also, Evrim, for your introduction. As was said, I am involved in activities of Central and Eastern European Society for Phenomenology, and that's my background from which I also follow the topic today. So I will draw on the philosophical anthropology of Helmut Plessner and his key concept, utopian standpoint. My reading of his text, however, will be phenomenological, because, as I will try to show, phenomenology and philosophical anthropology can work well together. It evaluates both Plessner's insightful findings regarding the monopoles of the human being and penetrates in a phenomenologically relevant way into the structure of experience and its motivational contexts. Along with this, it reveals the manifoldness of manifestation in the world, Lebenswelt, Umwelt, and in the society and community. Such intersections of Husserl's and Plessner's thinking have already been undertaken by a number of scholars in contemporary discourse, to mention, for example, Maren Verle in the case of corporality, Thiemo Breyer in the case of intersubjectivity, or Thomas Fuchs in the context of phenomenology and the biology of the embodied mind. I also draw an issue of corporality and avant-garde art that offers interesting connections. I will now try to look at another heuristic possibility of this combination of phenomenology and philosophical anthropology, namely, perhaps surprisingly, in the case of Plessner and Patočka. In both thinkers, we find not only a conceptual correspondence, but also a bridge between phenomenology and anthropology in the issue of space and home. I will look at the following texts. In Patočka's case, these will be reflections on the problem of space from 60s and on the sculpture from 1969, but also on the question of philosophizing in the margins from the last period of his work, from 1977. In Plessner, I will draw, of course, on the final session of his seminal work, Levels of the Organic Life and the Human, where one finds an elaboration of the concept of eccentric positionality in relation to human's place in the world in the form of a utopian standpoint, rootedness, home, but also a fundamental impossibility of finding a definitive answer to this need for human's place. To introduce these approaches, I will give some examples of concrete architecture that could be associated with the presented conceptions. In this paper, I would like to follow two goals. Firstly, the aim is to demonstrate the constitutive contribution to the relation of human beings to the space around them, which is established by the relation of non-place. In both Plessner and Patočka, home emerges as a place that is constituted by being addressed by the other and by the unfolding of the verticality of experience, as is also the case in the religion and art creation. In the second part, I will demonstrate that the dynamics of movement described by the utopian standpoint and the process of rooting can be complemented by the specific phenomena, such as marginocentric phenomena, determining the center from the position of the margin. In this, the points of overlap in both thinkers, I hope, can be found. And in relation to this topic, I will also present some selected examples from the Central and East European context from which I come. So the Plessner's approach. Plessner's contribution is particularly connected with the concept of so-called eccentric positionality, which he introduced in his work, Levels of Organic Life and the Human. Plessner divides his work into three parts, as is known, dealing with the plant, animal, and human spheres. And in the final chapter, he presents three anthropological principles, which are then also crucial for the function of further investigations of human corporality, relation to the environment, behavior, sociality, and expressivity. The contradiction in this phrase, eccentric and positionality, captures the human in the dynamics of living experience. I am always already in the world, experiencing in the situation and according to the situation. I am feeling it in terms of its incorporation into the context of life, other experiences, expectations, memory. Experiencing, feeling, and conducting life, as is the case of all living organisms, unfolds in correlation with the space, environment, Umwelt, in which one finds oneself. At the same time, however, in the case of human, this does not happen in a purely centralized or purely external way. This distinguishes human from the animal and vegetative mode of existence. But it does not happen in a fully transparent way either. We know our situation, but we cannot anchor our own essence in a fixed way. As Plessner describes by defining human being as homo absconditus. On this basis, then, we can see humans coping with her nature as a matter that forces one to take an attitude toward it, and thus to lead one's life. This coping with oneself, seen in the perspective of the three anthropological principles, means that human is both natural and artificial, enacts our nature by creating and using a variety of artifacts that help human to cope with his situation. The hand is a good example here in its creative and collaborative collaboration with material, where not only its anthropological but also phenomenological contexts of its tactile constitution can be traced. One experiences immediately, but one also finds oneself in mediated relationships in the environment with other people that are at the same time embedded in corporality and experience in their immediacy. These two principles alone would seem sufficient for the problem of the constitution of space, for their starting point is corporeal experiential being in the world, that extends into a social and cultural dimension. One could say that already from this position, it is possible to see how Plessner contributes to architecture, for example, within the framework of the constitution of corporality, Leib im Körper, and the relation to the Umwelt, and from the perspective of constitution of social relations in community or society. As, for example, Robert Mugrauer, Gerald Adler, Volker Welter convincingly show. Human thus realizes our existence by the conduct of the life as a search for balance, harmony, equilibrium, grounded in the constitution of the human being in the world, which is, first of all, a demonstrative experiential space in which we orient ourselves, move, grasp things, and develop relations to others. However, Plessner introduces a third principle at the end of his book, although very briefly. This principle expresses the tension between place and non-place. And here Plessner also comes to the issue of home. Thus, in the conduct of life, human being experiences in a fundamental way her place, but also uprootedness, non-place in the world. This idea leads Plessner to uncovering of significant phenomena that express peculiar situation of a person oscillating between taking root and aiming for home on the one hand, and the impossibility of finding one's definitive place on the other. I quote, "While it still stays essentially tied to the here and now and has lived experiences without turning its gaze upon itself, taken instead by the objects in its environment and the reactions of its own being, it is capable of distancing itself from itself, of introducing a gap between itself and its lived experiences. This places it on both sides of the gap, bound in soul, bound in body, and at the same time, nowhere, without place, and unbound in space and time. This is the human. Plessner shows that while the centrality of existence is based on a way of being here and now, the eccentricity inherent to a person exposes her to her nowhere. We can ask, what forms does this eccentricity take in the case of space? A person's place is determined by her here, where it is her place, but at the same time, she is in relation to it from some elsewhere, a non-place, for example, in the perspective of where can I return to? Human beings are ubiquitous and can settle under almost any conditions, as Joachim Fischer points out, and yet, at the same time, because of the irrevocable positionality of their vitality, they must settle, place, locate, build, remain, however temporarily, in a specific location. Each of these spatial formations, which they construct with space-forming objects such as walls, windows, and doors, is a demarcation and distinguishes the inside from the outside and between above and below. So outer and inner, upper and lower, near and far, close and open, these are the delineations that manifest in architecture at the performance of the boundaries, Grenzleistung, Grenzverkehr, in which human beings express and realize themselves. At its base, then, it is a realization of subjective relations, not only a schematization of space. And this performance of boundary is based on the relationship between one's corporeality and the shaping or reshaping of space, which naturally includes social rooting and thus a home. But as an anthropologist, however, Plessner is also looking for the monopoles behind these human achievements, not just the solution of projects. And here again, we can draw on the utopian standpoint as a particular configuration of human experience. For every construction is a tracing of an anthropological constant in a topos. I quote, because the brick in the construction of a house is already an understood incomprehensibility. Stone and the curved wood, the hammer and iron are crossed in the odd inevitable union of the incomprehensible and the world of the work in which purpose and meaning are inserted. Every certainty is conquered out of uncertainty. Here is also reflected the main characteristic of the utopian standpoint as a nullity and transcendence, as Plessner calls this section of his book, which also reflect in historical formations and expressions. But one experiences it in oneself as the nullity of one's existence and the nullity of the world, on the one hand, and on the other as coping with the fundamental verticality of existence in the form of a search for a reinforcement or support, a transcendence that takes home as a place to which can I return. I quote, and so he, human, awakens to the consciousness of the absolute contingency of existence, and thus to the idea of a ground of the world, of the absolute or God. At the core of the effort to overcome rootlessness lies thus religiosity. Religion provides the ultimate bound and integration, the place to live and the place to die, security, reconciliation with fate, interpretation of reality, a home. It was a quotation. This does not, however, eliminate the tension of rootlessness. On the contrary, It cannot be reduced to a definitive individual solution. Rather, it opens up a space for creative treatment, creative subjective responses to the doubt about the unity and foundation of the world, which forces humans to search for new possibilities of support. We will see how this works in Patočka. However, Plessner states at this point following. This dependency on support for his own existence outside of the sphere of reality means that reality, outer world, inner world, shared world, which is essentially correlated to his existence, necessarily becomes in a need of support itself. In relation to this reality transcending point of support or anchor, reality then joins together into the one world, into the universe. Eccentric positionality, to assume, thus allows insight into human situation, that the world becomes a space of possibilities of being otherwise, that we is the background for the self in its possibilities of realizing in the world, but also for experiencing the possibility that the world can be otherwise as well. Our home in the world involves being dependent on the unity of the world in which we find ourselves in order to be able to return home. But this endeavor is permitted and, according to Plessner, opens us up to blessed strangers, as Plessner puts at the very end of his book. Now let's look at Patočka's approach. How does he address the topic of space? It seems that we can draw a parallel here. Conception of world and space is present in Patočka in various places, but I will draw on the manuscripts that were available in collected works in 2016. We could say that, like Plessner in his first two anthropological principles, Patočka starts from the spatial orientation and the reality which one has contact through perception and corporeal movement. I quote, "We think of a very definite reality, precisely a reality, endowed with a typical quality of existence as realized by our sight, our touch, our kinesthesia." But as with Plessner, certain deepening of experience is at the core of Patočka's building of home. Let me briefly present main theses from his manuscripts in 3 points. Firstly, the settling apparatus, as Patočka calls it, is based on the original non-homogeneity of sensory space and kinesthesia. Such a personal space of life as the establishment of tactile visual correspondence is also determined by the fundamental addressing by the other, and this, according to him, means the first architecture. Secondly, he further points out that it is not just a matter of understanding the relations as they are already laid out, arranged, already incorporated into space, but rather, and precisely, how they are getting into arrangement, for which he uses the word impossible to translate, getting or moving into order, the inclusion of the being into the totality of world. The realization of relation does not take place in the space in which the subject is, but by relating which the subject itself is. And this is not itself spatial. And third point, the spatial forming phenomenon here is the original addressing and orientation that where we are, which is not determined by us, but by thou and that. At the same time, Patočka says that home, as our place in the world, is constituted by relations of exchangeability of I for the thou, but by the non-exchangeability of the unique functions. We might also describe this as what is intimate, close, and the personal. This is where I dwell. The solid construction is then the possibility of cohabitation, the possibility of this primary intimate we. This implies, we could say, that space as an original within thus includes beyond. This beyond has a twofold form. The constitution of space takes place initially with the addressing of the self by the other, as well as the original fixation in the world is carried by the supports emanating from the world towards the self. Patočka traces both the organization of the space of human being and the order of the world as a universe that reflects this personal space of home. The most intimate as home is thus a kind of inversion, transubstantiation, and appropriation of space as incorporation into the order of universe. Similarly, Finnish architect Juhani Palasmaa says, in an experience of place, particularly that of home, the external world and space become internalized. They are sensed as intrapersonal conditions. It can be said that the homestead is a place of generational continuity, just as the cosmos is the home of living being. The primary is the home as a kindly, intimate, warm space of the we, from which comes the aforementioned transcendent spiritual dimension of the order of the world as a universe. So according to Patočka, the first is the nest which is a place of rest, security, offspring, the original relationship of mother and child in the intimacy of early days. Then it is the windbreak, the partition that protects the fire, but is also a constitutive phenomenon of shelter building. The cave, at the third example, is the discovery of interior space at the private space of human being. I quote, "The creation of one's own world as a physical reality is a homestead and a house." In Patočka, however, we find another textual source where he speaks of architecture in relation to touch and material like stone and clay, the transformation of nature or material into sculpture. Here in artistic experience too, we can encounter the ground of the world. I quote, "The place oneself in a material space, but at the same time, it means to transform from the ephemeral to permanent, to detach from oneself, from the non-essential, to reduce it to essential, to the primordial forces expressed in the primordial forms. That is why sculpture is essentially a search for the origin," in quotation. Thus, as we have seen, for Patočka, first architecture is based on the spiritual dimension and art rather than on the practical transformation of space. It is constituted by men, but in such a way that this work product construction is created in relation to that which is not only human work. To illustrate this more concretely, let me give examples of architecture which will be very different, very distinct. Plessner mentions the urban districts of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Dessau, and Gerald Adler mentions Josef Frank's beer house in Vienna as an example that captures Plessner's approach. If Plessner states that the brick in the construction of house is an already understood incomprehensibility, completely new situation of social and technical transformations at the beginning of 20th century were reflected in tendencies in art and architecture. Plessner draws attention to this in the text Rebirth of Form in the Technical Age from 1932, which was written on the occasion of 25th anniversary of the Deutscher Werkbund and highlighted architecture that worked with space and face of the landscape and environment. Plessner asked in his call for a rebirth of form in architecture, if form is a certain relation, measure, equilibrium, how is this equilibrium set in the age of instability, new possibilities, which were seldom led to situations that could be called balanced? But the other example could be mentioned as well, other building, where Plessner was involved personally. The second example, reflecting the constitution of space, is a relation to non-place, is a situation of emigration and situation of refugee. This experience is also present in Plessner. Here we can mention his house project prepared with Verbund member Lucy Hillebrand. It was, from the architectural point of view, an interesting achievement that arose in attention for sensitivity to the architectural plan and understanding of the space for living. In this case, an intellectual which experiences of emigration and re-emigration. Plessner was himself in this situation in Turkey and the Netherlands, besides experiencing non-acceptance and also acceptance in different environments. Karol Edice, Plessner's biographer, summarizes the description of his house as simple, very large windows areas that allowed for free view and passages, a hall, bright colors, library, a place for discussions, gallery with from paintings of Max Beckmann, with whom he shared experience of refugee in Netherlands. Plessner carefully considered in this project the presence of guests coming from different countries to feel welcome. However, in Patočka, we can trace the motives of primordial creation. For him, the constitution of space, so an addressing from the non-self or non-place, the outside, takes the form of a sacred spiritual dimension, a primordial I-you-it relation at the original character of the within. Nicolas de Voren mentions Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia as a possible example in connection with Patočka, which expresses the function of sacred and the implementation of the cosmos as a home. As stated in his article, I quote, "It could be seen as evidence that the origin of towns did not develop from smaller conglomerates of villages, but on the contrary, that the town has its origin in religious sanctuaries or temples. The implementation of human collective existence in a space of dwelling, the household, is based on the institution of the sacred, in conjunction with the attitude towards human mortality, mythology of death, where death provides the underlying continuity and solidarity of human beings with the other, the living and dead." To this, we could add an example from the report Cappadocian Reborn, Cave, Man and Space, and it's a province of Nevşehir, settled in the Byzantine period, which offers a unique example of dwelling in caves, rock formations, interconnecting humans' work of retreating back into nature, including sacred spaces, multi-layered vernacular architecture, with the layerings of different historical periods, different sensual experiences, light, darkness, warmth, but also a unique approach to the materials that offer possibilities for human. It is also significant that Juhani Palasma, whose work is based on phenomenological and existential analysis of experience and creative process, is mentioned when working with a multidimensional space, its genealogy and the search for an appropriate approach to its preservation. These examples, which could be mentioned, is a further special art, especially sculptural work, which shows the transformation of the self into the object, just as the self is placed in space. As we have said, Patočka traces the original creation and speciality, especially hereditary structures which refer to ovals. And in this sense, one could mention sculptures of ovoid shapes as in Brancusi, or the Slovak sculpture Marie Bartusova. Just to mention a short comment on Bartusova, she was marginalized during the during the communism and worked in some connection also to phenomenology. And now her work reached international evaluation. Also, these examples are distinct and articulate possibilities for working with addressing from other, with non-place, and search for constitutive elements for the home. Nevertheless, the question here is how can it be elaborated further? So I should skip some passages to fill my time. So the experience of being off-centered as part of eccentric positionality shows that we are always in relation to situation in which we are confronted with a constitution of experience and non-home. But we can overcome this alterity in a constitution of home. How can we permanently settle the questions? Can we overcome and can be permanently settled? Both Plessner and Patočka point to the fact that need of maintaining this tension. It demands such a fixing, but constantly resents it again in a continual annulment of its own thesis. According to Plessner, according to Patočka, the original dimension of being in space is a process of moving into order. This follows, in fact, the basic need, as Plessner mentions it. However, as we have seen, both thinkers extend the demonstrative and Schaulicher space to non-place and addressing to transcendence, not unlike what happens in the space of religion and artistic creation. This maintaining of tension between place and non-place, or between here and there, me and other, thus provides a source of constructive and even creative potentials for, I quote Plessner, the way in which and the degree to which artistic achievements develop depend on the intensity and orientation in this need, which seems to initially be motivated by the tendency to preserve and structure what is fleeting in life by giving it form. That the question of work, activities, or sources of creativity that comes from a specific being in a space. So, and I will now go through the phenomena that I specially localized in the context of Central and Eastern Europe, and which also uses literary places to provide insights into human experience in articulating one specific place, and it's, in this case, interactive cultural place. They concern so-called marginocentric phenomena and bring a particular experience that is characterized precisely by the transition or juxtaposition between periphery and center. This transition is able to reformulate the basic need, the creative basic need, in a new way, overcoming seemingly pre-designed patterns. In other words, this author, whom I quotes, they have rewritten the national cultural paradigm from the margin, ascribing to it a dialogue dimension both internally, in dialogue with the other ethnic traditions, and externally, in dialogue with larger geocultural paradigm. This notion is well known, is not anchored in philosophy, but in literary studies, and is associated with a specific spaces, especially urban spaces associated with plurality of traditions, themes, and hybridizations, clash of different cultures. And this can be exemplified by the cities on the river Danube, as is present in famous Claudio Maragri's book. These places have become a node with our own history and narrations, a space of different synergy and mixing. What is peculiar to them is the geographical location on the crossroads or at the edge. In the case of Bratislava, for example, it was Slovak-Czech, Slovak-Hungarian, Slovak-Austrian space. Specific formations of thinking on the periphery and the forms of production that result from this position also come to the fore here. Authors examining marginocentric places in literary narratives also refer to them as eccentric. Space of Central Eastern Europe is often defined as marginal, characterized by continuous attempts to cope with historical situation. These experiences influence the way of thinking and creating. They can take different forms in narratives, for example, in poetry and novels that cope with or escape from the nationalist or totalitarian tendencies by finding new patterns. To stay by Bratislava, I quote, it shows that literature prefers folds, nooks, and lively courtyards to the open and well-controlled buildings and space of late modernism. Alexander Kelly points to the mixing of urban topographies as an attempt to escape from the totalizing representations. And thus we can see on the presented pictures as Bratislava functions without dominant center, paradoxically instead of the historical castle ruined at the beginning of 20th century, the seemingly center was redirected to the Danube on the periphery of the city, which was not only a symbol, but also a real flowing stream, a place for walks on its bank, but also for exotic travel motifs, steamships, and the opportunities to set out on a journey to search for the unknown. I will skip the passage where I mentions the other aspect of marginalization of phenomenology itself in the space of Central and Eastern Europe, which functions as an unofficial philosophy, but in itself contains original and original thinking. And to conclude, I would only say that as Plesner and Patočka concerns space and home, not only in an experiential demonstrative Anschafflicher space, but also as a non-place, as a transcendent, which brings support from the side of the world as a universe for the place of the human. And the presence of transcendence, its inversion into the home, can be, besides religious aspect, extended to the search for source of creative possibilities by engaging the juxtaposition of the margin and center. So marginocentric phenomena can serve as an example of it in the case of Central Eastern Europe, but both thinkers offered some possible insights also in contribution to the genetic and generative phenomenology of the place and the human in the world. So thank you for your attention.